Hello, and welcome to Association Chat, an online discussion where we warm ourselves by the virtual fire with topics of the day, welcoming thought leaders and trailblazers alike to join up in this online home for the community. I'm the host of Association Chat, KiKi L'Italien. And how savvy is your board when it comes to understanding financials for your association? How savvy does it need to be? These are good questions. Melisa Galasso is the founder and CEO of Galasso Learning Solutions. She's a CPA with over 20 years experience, and she designs and facilitates accounting and auditing courses. Also happens to be the author of this great new book called Money Matters for Nonprofits: How Board Members Can Harness the Power of Financial Statements by Understanding Basic Accounting. This is the book that you all need to have in your stockings hung by the chimney with care, in your mailboxes because you're ordering them, and every single board member needs to have them. And with that, hello, Melisa. Thank you for joining us on Association Chat.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
I'm clearly very excited for you to be here too. I'm like already pushing this book. You know, when I got my hands on this, I was going through and was just so curious to see like what is in here, what is the advice, and there was. I hate to admit it, there were quite a few things that I thought I need to spend some time with this and really dig in. You have some amazing stories in this, just chock full of great information. But I want to just take a step back and understand why you create all of these different courses and you do all of these different workshops. Why did you decide Money Matters for Nonprofits was the book that you needed to write?
That's a great question. I obviously specialize in teaching CPAs, so people who are already accounting oriented, and we focus on what's changing or what some areas of focus are within the profession. And so I teach CPA firms, what's changing in accounting for nonprofits, what's changing in audits from nonprofits, what do they need to be aware of so that they can do an amazing job helping nonprofits get the financial statements accurate and give them insurance however they want it. And so obviously my target audience to some extent are really knowledgeable CPAs. But what I heard over and over again from my wonderful clients is, hey, we do all of this work. We put together the financial statements with the clients. We go over the accuracy of them. We are, presenting at the board meeting, and then the board members kind of like try not to make eye contact with us, and they don't, they don't want to be like on the spot asked any questions. And then we'll ask them like, do you have any questions? And everyone kind of looks away because they just don't have the capacity to really understand what we're presenting. And so they would always say, do you know of a book? And in preparation for writing this book, I read 15 books on nonprofit accounting, but they were either really, really heavy debits and credits, which is not what a board member needs to know in order to be a successful board member, or it was only about the governance side of the house where what are the fiduciary responsibilities, and maybe a chapter, which was a great chapter on accounting, but not enough to really fulfill the responsibility. And so I was like, I think I'm just going to have to write it. And normally I would travel pre-COVID pretty much every week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And during COVID, not as much travel. And so I had some more time than I normally did. So I did it.
This was a silver lining. This is a silver lining to you produced a book. Not a lot of us can say this.
I know some people are like, during COVID, you got nothing done. I'm like, well, I actually wrote a whole book and got it published. So I feel pretty accomplished.
Some people learned how to make really great bread, and you made a book. So there you go. So, okay. So where do you see most nonprofit boards getting it wrong? I mean, what is it about these nuances of nonprofit financials that are so, sort of mysterious or difficult for a lot of the boards that you see coming to you with questions?
So I think the biggest one is that whoever is the financial person is just responsible, right? So I hear a lot of that, like, well, we have a financial person on the board. That's their job. It's really everybody's job when it comes to governance to ask questions, because if you had a whole board filled with just people who are financial, you wouldn't be a successful, nonprofit. Like if you just think about this, right? Associations just filled with accountants don't bring diverse thoughts and diverse backgrounds. Like you need to have a board that has a marketing background and a philanthropy background and a passion for the organization. And you need all of these different people to really have a good board that asks the right questions. So having someone with financial experience is great. But if you're a marketing person and you know that something should be trending in a particular direction, and you see the opposite in the financial statement, you should be asking about that. That's something the financial person might not expect or know to expect. And so a lot of times what I hear is, oh, well, that's the finance person's job, or that's the finance committee's job. And that's not my problem. I don't have to worry about that. I don't need to know anything. I'm just going to approve that. If they say it's good, I'm going to just approve the financials. And that's really scary because you're equally all in it when it comes to fiduciary responsibilities. So everybody really has a responsibility to understand the financials and to ask questions of both management. And if there's an independent public accountant performing some type of either audit or review or compilation, that you're asking the right questions of that independent accountant to get the feedback that you need to make the decisions. And so I think one of the more common ones is just assuming that finance person's got it. Or the other one I hear pretty frequently is that I don't need to be a numbers person because that's management's responsibility, right? That's the person who's in management and they have to do it. So they're even taking off the board altogether. And that's also just not true because the board has certain duties that are responsible for it. And we have to ensure that we're compliant with that. And so we really need people to be asking questions and taking ownership as a governance role. And so I think those are probably the two most common is they try to just remove themselves from being responsible for the financials.
I think that the bringing in the governance part, understanding the fiduciary responsibilities, that was something that when I started working with Tecker, and Tecker International is the consulting firm that I end up doing a lot of the governance training with. And the fiduciary responsibilities, which seems to be like a very foundational thing that everyone would know, surprisingly is sometimes it's not the common knowledge you think is there. It's not even the knowledge that ends up being there. Even if you have an onboarding training in place, a lot of times it just doesn't stick. Why do you think that is?
Because I think a lot of times when people join a board, they have their idea of what they're going to do. And so when we get into it, like someone's really passionate about the organization, right? I've sat on several different boards, and very often these are our most passionate, either volunteers or passionate supporters. And they really care about the organization and they're on the board for their one particular thing that they want to accomplish, right? So they're like, I want to grow this, or I want to get involved in this. And they don't think about, well, I'm also signing up as a board member, right? So like,
Right.
what does that actually entail? Like, I'm not just there to do this one thing anymore. I have a much bigger responsibility. And you can talk about it, but they're like, well, that's not a big deal. Or, how hard can that be until you actually have fraud, or you have a lawsuit, or you have, non-compliance, or you have to give back federal funding, right? And then you see oh no, this is a big deal. Oh, I have to sign this, or I'm being subpoenaed, or I'm being questioned. And then they're like, oh, well, maybe there was more to this than just the one thing I joined the board in order to accomplish.
Right, right. I think so many times it is something where they're passionate, or they see their peers or their colleagues that have served on the board, and they say, okay, this is something I'll do. And they sort of just expect things to be easy and sort of rolled out to them rather than having to dig into the hard work sometimes that exists underneath it. That's why, in this book, which I have to say, okay, COVID, maybe, but this is a really good, tight book full of help. Like, I don't think there's anything wasted in what I went through. It's really good, but it's not like the dictionary of all things accounting. So, which I really appreciate. So, for those people who might be battling their own time issues, and say that there's this magical problem with books where there was only one chapter that remained of every book, and for you got to choose the one chapter that remained, what would you hope would be the one chapter in this that everyone read?
I mean, obviously, I'm a big fan of all the chapters, but chapter
Yes.
7 to me is probably one of the ones that you get the most application out of. I think that a lot of that, you have to start with the theory, like what is a financial statement? What are the elements of a financial statement? But if that's all you have, right, that's just really nice theory with no practical application. And chapter 7 was intentionally written once we had the skill set we needed to be able to do evaluation to really evaluate the nonprofit. How is it doing? Is it achieving its objectives? Is it financially sound? Do we have the right structure? And you can't really answer that if you don't have any tracking. And so chapter 7 is on ratios, trends, and analysis. And it really gives us an understanding of, okay, well, what is our expectation? What are we doing to check in and to see how we're doing? And so the board's job is to say, okay, we've set management on this direction. We've given them this strategic direction that we want them to go. Well, are they getting there? And so when we look at this, right, so we might create a budget. Well, how are we doing a budget to actual? Like, how are we achieving this, right? Budgets aren't a once a year we do it and then we bring it out next year, right? How are
Mhm.
we doing compared to budget? Why are we missing certain items? What are, what can we do to fix it? How can we be proactive instead of reactive? And so chapter 7 really walks through these KPIs and in particular financial ratios that often are different than what we would look at it in a corporate environment. So even people who have a really strong financial background might not have a nonprofit financial background. And so they might
Mhm.
not, you want to look at income or profit or margin, right? Those things aren't going to help you evaluate your nonprofit. The goal here is to ask, well, what things make sense for a nonprofit?
So let's dig into this. I want to explore a mini lesson from you and to see, like, could you give us a mini lesson on something like this concept of ratio analysis? How would you describe that concept? What would a board member need to understand about it?
Sure, I'd love to do mini lessons. I'm a instructor by trade. I actually
Yes.
went back to school, so I am a licensed CPA, obviously. But I went back to school and got a certification first in instructional design, how to actually write courses, and then I went back and got my certified speaking professional and talent
Wow.
development and how do you deliver it. So I have a passion for sharing information with others, which is kind of evident in what I want that book to achieve. But ratio analysis really helps you understand, the impact of changes in the financial statement. So one of the biggest ones for nonprofits is liquidity. And the easiest way to think about liquidity is, do I have enough money to pay my bills? Right? It's
Mm.
a pretty important concept that we would need. And there's different ways to evaluate that, like cash on hand. How many days do I have of cash on hand? Is that sufficient? Especially if we have a lot of investments, right? Cash on hand, do we have enough to pay our bills? Are we liquid enough? And COVID really put nonprofits to the test in this area because they weren't getting the same level of donation and they weren't getting the same level of supplies and they weren't getting the same level of contributions. And so, did you have the cash to make the basic payments? And do you have enough to get through? And so, I love to look at liquidity because I really think that helps us. It also looks at things like, are we putting too much in investments that are not liquid, that are hard to get out?
Mhm.
And so, we might want to have better return, right? Those tend to have good return, but are we risking that with going in? And so a lot of associations have really nice investment policies that will come back and say, okay, well, this is the percentage that has to be in a particular, liquidity. And so we kind of evaluate that. So we look at things like a current ratio, comparing our current assets to our current liabilities, right? So not just AP, but all of the things that we would have to pay over the next year. If the entity has a lot of debt, right? That's, if they don't have debt, then we don't have as much of a concern. But if there is debt, how much do we have in terms of debt coverage? And so we look at things like, all right, given what we have on hand, how much, do we have in excess of what we need to pay, right? So you think about our required debt payment, right? We have all of these other things that have to be paid. How comfortable are we? And so that's
Mhm.
another great example of, right, taking that information and saying, okay, well, how can I then apply this as we go through it? So that's one example of a ratio type.
So we have a question from Barb. Hi, Barb. She asks, what is her background with government, county and local municipalities, audit? understanding those budgets. Interesting question. I mean, so care to answer? I don't know.
Sure. I do both nonprofit and government. Government has a completely different set of rules. They have two different bases of accounting. So they have what we consider the current financial resource measurement focus, which is more budgetary and cash based. And then they have their full accrual method for their like government wide. And so governments have a different standard setter. Nonprofits are going to be done under the FASB side of the house. Governments are done under Governmental Accounting Standards Board, or GASB. And so that is really important as well. And so you do have what we call governmental type nonprofits. So for example, a public university doesn't follow nonprofit accounting. So this book would not be the right book for a governmental nonprofit, because that would be FASB GAAP as opposed to GASB GAAP. My long-term theory is this: if this book does well, I would like to think about part 2, which would be to do this again for governmental organizations. So sort of the next step.
I did notice that Money Matters, which is a great title, and then for nonprofits seems to lend itself well to it being for the next thing and for the next thing. So yeah, so you're foreseeing maybe this series that happens. Yes.
Potentially, depending. Again, this was quite a bit of undertaking. It took over a year to do the whole book and to get it to publishing. So it's an undertaking. It's a lot of investment. So hopefully, so apparently Barb needs book 2. So
yeah, Barb wants book 2. You better get on it. You better get on it. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me because everything, it does have its nuances. And so even if, and you said this right out of the gate, even if a board member is familiar with the way that they look at their financial statements for their organization, their company, there are certain things that they need to pay attention to for a nonprofit that are just different. And so along with that, there are the dangers, and you kind of spoke to them a little bit before, but can you talk to me a little bit more about what are the dangers for those board members who aren't seeing that connection? They don't think that they need to they don't see that imperative in understanding the financial statements.
Yeah, I think there are a lot. There's fraud, there's non-compliance, but one of the ones I always think about is reputational risk, right? Nonprofits receive the bulk of their funding from either contributions or governmental type funds. And if you don't have good controls over this and your organization ends up doing something that makes the front of the paper that maybe you don't want to be on the front of the paper for, there's a lot of repercussions. I actually used the example in the book of Wounded Warriors, which was a phenomenal organization, very important purpose. They supported 9/11 first responders, but they made the paper for elaborate and very lavish celebrations, very, very high salaries for the CEOs, very lavish parties. And then they made the paper. People were like, well, I'm not going to donate if that's how they're going to spend my funds. And so they had a significant drop. And they turned over leadership. They replaced everybody. The board kind of took hold and said, okay, well, now we have a problem. So instead of the board being very permissive, the board fired the CEO and the CFO, brought in new people, and they have really turned the organization around, but they're still not at making the paper levels. And so there's a real risk out there to boards who are just very permissive and, well, I don't want to step on the CEO or the director, right? I want to be friends. I want them to, be happy. Well, you want to be friends, right? We want to be supportive, but we also have a due diligence in there. And if we're not doing what we're supposed to do, and that ends up with a massive fraud or massive non-compliance, and somehow someone gets a hold of that on the news and blasts it all over the place, you might not be around this time next year because you can see a complete drop off in support. And when you don't have any support, it's very hard to be an organization. And so associations really need to protect their reputational risk. You don't want to have something or even someone cause an issue for what's going to happen down the pipe, right? Membership drops significantly. People don't want to be associated with that organization anymore. And now you have less members, you have less support, you're not getting any grants. And you're like, okay, well, I can't survive like this. I'm no longer relevant. And so I think it's really important that the board understand that that's their job. They're there to protect the organization.
What questions do you think are the most important questions that a board member can ask when looking at an association's financials?
Well, the first one is why aren't we tracking to budget, right? Why are we
Mm.
not there, right? So if someone's taking the time to do, for example, a budget to actual, what are our problems? How can we help, right? So it's not about blame. It's about, okay, well, we're not hitting it because of X, right? What can we do about this? How can we support you? What can we do to step in and maybe do some phone calls or maybe, help with getting more people to attend the event or whatever it is. The first question is, what are we doing that's not tracking to budget? The second thing is when we're looking at these KPIs and we have problems with liquidity or we have problems with the ratios and that they're not reflecting what we want, what can we do about them in a proactive manner? Because a lot of these are what we would call leading indicators, right? Where it can kind of see something coming and we can be proactive and fix it before it becomes a problem. Now, some of them are lagging and you only find about it after the fact. And then you're like, oh, well, we now have to fix it. But the more proactive we can be, we can get ourselves out of trouble ahead of time, which is why I like budget to actual, because you're watching, you're going, all right, first month, we're not making it. Second month, they're not making it. Okay, now I'm seeing a trend here. Maybe budget wasn't realistic. We just can't achieve that. That's not going to work for us. Maybe we need to step back and ask ourselves, is that still our priority, right? During COVID, a lot of entities were like, that's not our priority anymore. Our priority has to change. We have a global pandemic, right? What can we do to stay solvent, right? So that became more of the issue. Or how can we retain membership? I was on a board during COVID, and that was the first thing was like, okay, we are definitely discretionary spending. We are definitely, not a requirement. So how can we encourage people when they're maybe not at full employment or maybe they're afraid of layoffs? How can we still encourage them? What can we provide to keep the membership coming and to keep people renewing and fulfill our responsibilities, even if we can't do in-person meetings or if we can't do that, right? So our responsibilities shifted greatly during COVID. So I don't believe in just saying, okay, this is what we have to do, but we have to ask ourselves, is this still what we want to do? And if the answer is yes, what are we going to do about it?
Do you think that the questions have shifted because of COVID? I mean, certainly a lot of different organizations, and especially I look at the association realm and I think about all of the canceled meetings and all of the issues that came about because of that. Some of these reserves, which so many of us were saying, how much in reserves do you actually need?" Ended up
Now you
getting
know.
tapped into.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, do you think that a lot of these questions have changed, or are they pretty much consistent no matter what? I mean,
I
I'm
think
curious to hear what you
objectives
say.
changed. Yeah, I think,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I think objectives had to change during COVID. And, I'm on a board right now that we keep comparing ourselves to what we call our pre-COVID numbers, right? So we
Mhm.
keep looking at the number of participants in our programs, and we're still not at pre-COVID numbers. And so when we look at this, our goal is just to get back to COVID. It's not to grow from where we were, it's just to get back to where we were. And so I think the questions, lend themselves to, well, what is our current primary issue? And so if you want to, for example, get more grants or you want to take on a particular project, but you haven't been able to fulfill your actual primary responsibility, especially in a membership organization, you have to start asking yourself, well, how can I do this differently, right? How can I still provide training, right? How can I still provide something that people want, but in a safe environment? There's a lot of people who are not comfortable, that are not ready to go back to the big, gigantic meeting of the association where everyone's together. They're just not there yet. And we need to say, well, how can we still fulfill that members, need, and how can we keep them coming? And so the board has to really think about, okay, well, what is our purpose? What are we trying to achieve? How can we still
Mhm.
achieve that? And then kind of benchmark. And so, for the board that I serve on, our benchmark is, how do we get back to pre-COVID participation? Right? That's what we're looking for. We want to get people back involved. And we're asking the questions like, well, why aren't people signing up the same rate? Or what is causing the prohibition? Can we do as an alternative? Right? So, oh, well, you want to do this virtually. Okay, let's see what we can do. And start asking those questions, because I do think COVID changed how we think about how we provide things. It used to be, well, this is how we do it. And if you want to come, great. And if you don't want to come, also fine. But now
Yeah.
there's more of a, give and take. You can't just be like my way or the highway, because it's a membership organization at the end of the day.
It is interesting. I do think that we saw people changing the way that they make decisions. Certainly during the first couple of years of COVID, because there were so many restrictions in place and concerns about risk and safety. Now it seems that there's something else, which is now that we know there are other alternatives that can work, now that we've experienced sitting out on and missing some of this travel and some of the stuff that we used to do all the time, maybe the priorities have shifted. Maybe the way we make our decisions, it's a little bit different. We're expecting organizations to bring us alternatives. So, I mean, I guess when you're looking at the financials, all of that's kind of feeding into it too, because you're looking for, I guess, verification or validation of some of these guesses that you're making in the numbers, right?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of financial statement numbers are what we call estimates, right? There are
Yeah.
best estimate of what we think that number is going to be. And I would bet that a lot of people would be, not surprised to find out that our estimates weren't so great during COVID, or that things
No.
change, right? So when we think about pensions, right? I know not all organizations have pensions, but pensions, literally, in order to come up with a pension estimate, we have to predict when the person's going to die, how old they're going to be when they die, when they're going to retire, how much money they're going to make when they retire. And that person might be 22 today, right? And we have to predict all of this out. And so mortality tables change, right? So numbers that are estimates have what we call innately, what we call an inherent risk of estimation uncertainty. And so we want the numbers to be as accurate as they can be with the information given, right? It's not at all cost. I'm not looking down to the penny, right? Most of us consider the concept of materiality, but we want the numbers to be materially right. And we want to have an expectation of what the future is going to look like. And it might shift, right? Your exchange to non-exchange revenue might shift. Your government assistance might shift, right? All of these different types of processes out there. The other thing I see right now is that for many nonprofits, all types of nonprofits, whether they are universities, whether they're hospitals, whether they are, associations, right? We're seeing a shift in what was provided in terms of support, right? The CARES Act really provided immediate assistance, right? PPP loans and
Mhm.
the immediate needs provider relief fund, right? They were out there to be spent quickly. And then CAA and ARPA had much more long-term planning in them, but they had some immediate assistance like shuttered venues. For many nonprofits, shuttered venues was what kept them going. And then you kind of keep going through. That money is running out. And so when we talk to some nonprofits right now, they're not back at pre-donation levels. They're not back at exchange levels. They're not back. Their government assistance has declined rapidly. And the question is, what are we going to do about it, right? We can't just hope, right? Hope is not a strategy. We
Yeah.
need to be thoughtful about what we're going to do going forward. And the conversation has to change now, because it's not about the government assistance. That's kind of weaning out at this point. There's still some money out there, but what are we going to do? Because we can't just, we have to eventually figure out, well, how are we going to be self-sufficient again? Otherwise, again, like you said, there will be no reserves left at some point.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing that I think about is when you see the boards coming together and really trying to figure out how to make the best possible knowledge-based decisions that they can. It's certainly helpful for them to understand a little bit more about how these financials work when they're working with a nonprofit. And I don't know, I have a lot of complaints about a lot of the onboarding or lack thereof that happens for a lot of boards in the association realm. But do you have ideas? Have you seen some maybe best in show examples of organizations that are really walking their board members through a training or through lessons about what they need to understand about nonprofit financials that you say, they're getting it right? That's the way to do it.
I've seen a couple of different options. One is having whoever is responsible for financial reporting within the association coming back and doing regular updates, right? Not waiting once a year for the audit to come and to have the approval of the financials, but on a regular basis, having not only the numbers, but maybe the KPIs or the ratios that we've selected. And we said, okay, these are the 5 things that we're looking at. We're looking at liquidity ratio. We're looking at our membership coverage, right? So we're going to go through all of these different items, and they are regularly talking about them, and they're asking questions, and they're saying, okay, how could we do this differently? And they're engaging board members. So the first thing is the person who's responsible is engaging the boards on a regular basis. The other thing I see very done very well is when they do take the time to, when they onboard people, not just talk about the organization, but what are the goals of the organization and how do the financials tie into that? So we actually just did board orientation for our new board members. And one of the things we talked about is like, okay, well, this is how we get our funding on the exchange side. And this is how it's calculated. And this is how budget is basically written. And then our budget is based on the number of participants, right? So we, the more participants, the more costs. So we have to have a per participant kind of consideration, and we budget for X number of participants. And if we have more or less than that, right, that has to adjust. And then we talk about, okay, on the grant side of the house, these are the key supporters, these are our targets. And we literally prepare people for like, okay, so our expectation is for us to hit this number of participants. So we have to have you go out and help with that. And then this is our grant goal. And this is what our expectation is of the board in terms of either helping with grants or having the right contacts or even meeting with people for interviews when they want to do that as part of their grant making process. And we start upfront with, at the board orientation, this is what's expected of you if we want to hit these targets, if we want to be successful. It probably helps that their chair is a CPA.
Yeah, right. I know. I'm like, well, this is probably a really good example to learn from. Can you send me that slide deck at some point? Yeah.
We have we went detailed into that slide deck because of that, because we know that we need to hit certain girl numbers in order to be successful. And so if we don't hit those numbers, right, we have a problem all the way down the rest of the financials because everything is based off of it. And so if you don't make that point to the board, right, this is super important, then they're going to be like, oh, well, we're down a few people, or we're down a little bit on participation, and we can just blame COVID. But that's not financially sustainable. You have to be proactive about, okay, well, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah. Yeah. What is maybe one of I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this, but I'm just curious. What is maybe one of the most recent discoveries that you've made, decisions that you've made based off of numbers that you've seen in a financial statement? Let's say for maybe you shouldn't get for a nonprofit.
So I think in ratio analysis, even though maybe it's not an explicit example of what I've seen, but what I think people can do is in trend analysis, right? So you're looking at trend analysis and you're recognizing this trend is not favorable. And so as a result, we get together sort of like a risk management portion of the board meeting to say, okay, we have this unfavorable trend. What are our options, right? And so then we talk about, well, what can we do to fix this? What impact would it have? Because maybe I can go down this route, but it only mitigate a portion of it. And so we go through that and we really think about it. So having trends, not just looking at the current year, because that's a lot of times what happens is they present the current financial statements. Well, current financial statements are great. And sometimes they're comparative, sometimes they're not, but they don't tell the story. Financial statements are there to tell a story, right? That's why we have financial statements, is to tell the story of the organization. And so trend analysis, right, is there to pull together many, many years. And so you can just keep adding to it and then you can drop off some, but you can see the trend really early on to make that decision. And so when we look at KPIs and trends and things of that nature, we can see it before it becomes a problem if we're looking. And so when I sat on a board a couple of years ago during COVID, we had red, yellow, and green, right? Green was, okay, we're doing a great job. We're sure we're going to hit this, right? We would talk about them at the meeting, but it would be sort of like, oh, high five, like, great job. Okay, let's move on to the yellow. Okay, why are we yellow? What is it that we can do to support? What little things need to be fixed? And then we would spend the bulk of the meeting sitting there figuring out, well, what are we going to do about all this red? And the red came quickly during COVID, right? What we thought was green in the prior meeting somehow turned yellow quick and red even quicker. And so we're like, okay, the timing of it wasn't good because our fiscal was right at that April 30th. And so, can't really work too much outside of that. So you're like, okay, this is not good. We have to really think about next year differently. And we had to be proactive about it. But those red, yellow, and green, it is blatant what your topics are going to be, right? Your agenda is set by, okay, great, let's celebrate the good. I'm a big fan of you should celebrate all the good things. Too often we focus only on the bad. Celebrate the good, figure out what we're going to do about those yellows, and then spend the bulk of the meeting fixing the problem or deciding that that's just not the right path forward and we need to just do something different.
Yeah. I know that whenever I end up doing like a survey before a session, it's always those areas where there's a lot of disagreement where I'm like, oh, this is going to be a nice talking point. So, and you're saying in financial statements, the same. You got those areas in the red that need to be discussed. We're going to
Yeah.
spend a lot of time talking about those.
Yep. Absolutely.
Awesome. Oh my gosh. It's so good. I really feel like I am destined to be in one of your workshops or classes at some point. I do because, and I'm so thankful you wrote this book. Obviously, Barb out there who is watching, I don't know if she's still with us right now, is waiting for your next one. So I think you have a line. I think you have a whole series that needs to happen. Hopefully we don't need another pandemic to make sure that you have the time to do that.
No,
Um,
I don't wish a pandemic on anybody, but there's positive silver linings to be had at least.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Everyone, you need to go get this book, get this book, get this book. Money Matters for Nonprofits. Melissa, thank you so much for talking with us today. I really, really appreciate it. And if you don't mind, I'm probably going to want to come back with some follow-up questions down the road, maybe have you come back on so that we can talk about this a little bit more because I haven't read through all of it yet. And I know I'm going to have additional questions.
I would be happy to join you and talk about anything related to financial reporting and audits for your associations.
Thank you. See, everyone, you heard it here first. She said yes. So Barb says, great show. Thank you. Thank you, Barb, for being here. And thanks to all of you. Melissa, I am so thrilled with having Melissa on. It was such a great gift just to be able to learn and talk with her about some of these things that we need to pay attention to and some of the things that our boards really, really, really need to learn about financial statements. What were some of your questions? What are some of your follow-up actions, activities, things that you're going to do following this show because you heard from Melissa and heard some of the things that she had to say? I'd love to hear from all of you. And I hope that you'll take this time and you'll actually begin to think about some of those things that we've learned, not just from the conversation that we had today, but from some of those questions that came up while you were listening that made you think about more about your own work, the things that are happening back in the office, or if you're watching from your office right now, in your office right now. So until next time, everyone, I ask that you keep asking questions to learn every day, because as Joseph Campbell once said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. Have a great rest of the week, everyone.